Greetings, and welcome back to our continued edition of Alarm Clock, episode 1. So, last night we discussed the dissolution of Parliament and we spoke about the boundaries as stated in the Constitution as well as the 2015 Privy Council decision. We now know that the boundaries have not been changed for some 31 years. So, for the remainder of this show this evening, we're going to discuss the state of emergency, its limitations, the election process, and how can they both work together. So, as you know, last night we had persons who are all attorneys with a little bit of experience in parliamentary and House of Assembly proceedings. So we have Gian Williams, attorney and former deputy clerk of the House of Assembly. We have Azad Gums, attorney, former youth parliamentarian. Creos Freeman, also attorney and former youth parliamentarian. Garth Wilkin, attorney, and myself, Desi Brown, who is going to be your host for the rest of the evening. So just for those of you, and it's not set to be every Wednesday, but you'll always know once you subscribe to our YouTube channel as well as our Facebook pages. We'll keep you in check as to what's happening and when are we going to have our next show. We have a group of persons that brainstorms the show. Sometimes one may host, and you never know, we might not appear at all. We may invite other persons to have this discussion and take it away so that you can hear those varied perspectives. Additionally, it's not a bashing platform. It's an information session that is expected to just give you all the information about, so for example, we spoke about boundaries, what are they, and so forth. One day we'll talk about governance, one day we'll talk about voting. We'll just be discussing a few things related to politics and governance. It's an informational show, not a bashing platform. So we'll get right ahead and get into our discussion. So this evening, as I mentioned, we'll be talking about the elections process, the state of emergency and its limitations, and how both can work. So let's talk about the state of emergency. What is a state of emergency?
I trust that everyone
Zan?
can hear my voice. Hello?
Yes, we
Okay.
can.
Okay then. So
Hearing
state
you.
of emergency. A state of emergency, it is defined in our constitution. If we are to look at section 19 of our constitution, it defines what a state of emergency is. Also, if you look at the Emergency Powers Act, it also in its interpretation section 2, refers to what we call as a state of emergency, as a period of public emergency. And that definition is clearly given by our constitution. So what I found out is that the Constitution of St. Kitts and Nevis, the Emergency Powers Act, is consistent with the Constitution of St. Kitts and Nevis, and often the Emergency Powers Act references the Constitution that we have. And if you look at the Emergency Powers Act, the language of the Emergency Powers Act is similar to the language of the Constitution when speaking about the state of emergency and what can be done. So let's look at section 19 of the Constitution. Section 19 of the Constitution, subsection 1, speaks to the Governor General, and the Governor General having the power to call a state of emergency through proclamation. Subsection 2 speaks to what requirements must be satisfied for the proclamation to be made. And in subsection 3, it speaks about the time frame for the state of emergency. There's a 7-day time frame, there's a 21-day time frame, and then once it goes to the House of Assembly and gets 2/3 majority, then you could extend it beyond the 21 days. As you will have realized, initially, the executive will have made a decision of having the state of emergency and then the regulations, and then will have debated it in Parliament in form of resolution, and that resolution would have given them the authority to extend it more than the 21 days. It's also important to note that Parliament would have required a two-thirds majority support of the resolution, and that two-thirds majority, if the House comprises of 15 individuals, 15 members being both from the House of Representatives and from the Senate, which would be, if you'd have 15, that would be 10 persons, and if you have 14, that would be 9. Looking at Section 3 of the Emergency Powers Act, you would see that it gives the Governor General, again, similar to subsection 9, Section 19 of the Constitution, giving the Governor General the authority to make a proclamation once the conditions are satisfied. If you look at Section 4 of the Emergency Act, it talks about the proclamation to be communicated to the National Assembly, which is again similar to Section 19 of the Constitution, more specifically Section 19, subsection 3, which talks about the time frame. Section 5 of the Emergency Powers Act talks about the emergency regulations. And the emergency regulations, basically, those are what are called secondary legislation. We have primary legislation and we have secondary. Primary legislation would be an example of the Constitution, would be an example of an Act of Parliament. And sometimes Acts of Parliament can give rise to a minister making regulations coming out of the Act, where the Governor General confirms or imposes on a minister or a government department the ability to make laws consistent to the primary act. Looking at the Constitution as well, you would see that Section 20 of the Constitution, which is the interpretation section of the Constitution, it defines it refers to the public state of emergency. And if you look at subsection 3, it speaks to a member of the discipline force of St. Kitts and Nevis, giving that individual or giving that law, the disciplinary law, control. And when I say control, it gives them the authority somewhat to operate in a manner that would not be inconsistent with the fundamental rights that we have as Kittitians and Nevisians. If you look at subsection 3, it gives the defense force, the police force, and the prison service extended powers that they would not normally have during a period of normalcy. And if you look at the same subsection 3 of section 20, it refers to all the previous provisions within chapter 1 of the Constitution, which speaks to the fundamental rights, except sections 4, 6, and 7. Section 4 speaks to the right of life. Section 6 talks about not the protection from enforced labor, and section 7 speaks to the protection from inhumane treatment. So from my understanding, it would seem that the Constitution, although it gives the disciplinary force or disciplinary act power to somewhat make decisions that might, on the face of it, seem to go against, under normal circumstances, your what we call constitutional rights, it still protects persons, or it makes exceptions under section 4, which is the right to life, because I would assume if we have a state of emergency, that what is important is that we are having a state of emergency to protect individuals their right to life. We are protecting ourselves. So to give a defense force or police force or prison service power to take away that which you are trying to protect is somewhat it goes against the whole aim of a state of emergency, which is to protect the citizen from harm. Again, so section 6, we talk about protection from forced labor. Within section 6, though, it talks about an exception being that during a period of a state of emergency. So section 6 even gives the state power to do what they need to take care of the situation. Again, section 7 of the Constitution, which speaks to protection from inhumane treatment. Again, no matter what, the state is not supposed to treat persons inhumanely. So again, as individuals know, when we are under a state of emergency, the normal rights that you will have as citizens, it's somewhat curtailed. That is why a government is able to or through the state, through the police, the defense force, able to give curfews. Normally, we have freedom of movement, freedom of association, but through the state of emergency, certain regulations can be passed, and these regulations can limit those rights that we speak to. Again, from my research, it seems that it limits those rights, but it doesn't limit or it doesn't touch at all Section 4, Section 6, or Section 7 of our Constitution, which speaks to the right protection to the right of life, protection from forced labor, and protection from inhumane treatment. If we are to look at the Emergency Powers Act, it speaks about a number of sections, and just some sections that really stood out to me, and I noted them. Let me go to my notes. I noted some sections. We talk about Section 3, which gives the power to restrict access to certain places. Section 21, which gives the power to prohibit assemblies. Section 24, which gives the state right to impose curfews. We have Section 30, which speaks to the power to stop and search vehicles. Section 32, which talks about the powers of arrest. Section 36, which talks about offenses. And again, offenses, we know that the penalty for under the regulation is up to $5,000, and that comes directly from the Emergency Powers Act, Section 36 of that. You can be fined up to $5,000, or you could be in prison up to 12 months. Again, Section 40 of the same act, the Emergency Powers Act, gives the Governor General to delegate to this power to make regulations to the minister or to a government department. The minister being the minister responsible with national security. I also want to mention that within our Constitution, it allows the Governor General to impose a state of emergency either on the entire St. Kitts and Nevis, or on Nevis, or parts of St. Kitts and Nevis. So again, when we're looking at a state of emergency, it gives the Governor General to, so the powers to somewhat control the situation. When we look at state of emergency, the powers that are outlined, or the powers that are given by the Emergency Powers Act and the Constitution, these are, you operate in a manner that would help to deal with the situation. If you look at the Emergency Powers Act, it speaks about imposing such regulations to deal with the situation. So we have with us a pandemic where we are COVID-19, and so to deal with the situation, there is the imposition of curfews. There is the regulations that speaks to social distancing. There's the regulation that speaks to prohibition of social gathering, because we understand that you have to tailor the regulations to meet the circumstance or the situation in which you are facing. So for example, if the government was at war with a foreign state, and there are persons living along the coast, persons who occupy homes along the coast, and perhaps it would be in the state's best interest to have perhaps defense force persons there at the coast to protect its borders, that it would give the state the power to enter persons' homes, to seize those homes in order to be closer to the coast, in order to protect its borders. So when you look at a state of emergency, one has to look at the situation that the state is under, the circumstances, and what would be best in protecting the state, or protecting individuals from the situation at hand. That is basically for my presentation. I try to be as brief as possible, so persons don't get too bored and it doesn't come across too academic.
Thank you, Azad. Very, very, very important information that you pointed out there about the powers that the Governor General has, that the security forces has within the state of emergency. But we would definitely like to move forward to start discussing the elections and how, now that we know what the state of emergency is, how is that going to affect it? So we're going to ask Krios to step in and give us just some information very concisely about election day and the process. We're moving into elections. What is the process?
So, as we know, the parliament is now 2 days dissolved. So the question is, when are we going to have an election? How is that going to be triggered? I can say from the outset that is not triggered by the Prime Minister coming and saying, well, the election date is this, is that date, or what have you. An election is triggered by the issuing of writs by the Governor General. Of course, that would be based on the advice of the Prime Minister. And that word, that fancy word, writ, all it is that it's a document that is addressed to the returning officers and must be transmitted to them by the supervisor of elections. And that document would have the public seal on it, and it will specify the day and place of nominations of candidates, and if necessary, the day of the election, the day of the poll. And why I said if necessary is because there are circumstances and times, never happened in St. Kitts and Nevis as far as my research is telling me, but if on nomination day, only one candidate is nominated and no one else is nominated. Let's say in constituency number 6, Dr. Douglas is the only candidate who is nominated. Then there will be no election in that constituency. The return of Joy to return the writ to the Governor General stating what has happened and that Dr. Douglas would be the next representative for constituency number 6. And so the issuing of the writs, when that reaches the returning officer, they have certain responsibilities, certain critical responsibilities. And that is, first of all, the information in the writ has to be gazetted, and it has to be placed in at least one newspaper in circulation, St. Kitts and Nevis. Now, that is what starts the ball rolling, because when that information is gazetted and published, then you move to nomination. And that information must be gazetted and published in the newspaper for at minimum 7 days before you can have nomination. It can be there for 10 days or 15 days, but at minimum 7 days. So if you have them being published on the first of June, the earliest that nomination can take would be, because you would have to count the 1st of June, then you go the 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th. That's the 7 days, and then you come on the 9th, and nomination day can take place on that day. The returning officer also has some additional responsibility. Not only does he have to put this in the Gazette and in a newspaper, he's required to further publish the information, and he can put it up on a courthouse, a police station, a church, a chapel, a schoolhouse, or any other building in the constituency, or he oral public announcements through the public broadcasting station. Then there is another specific time period that must be adhered to. That is from nomination to be earlier than 7 days, 7 clear days after nomination day. So if you have nomination day on the 9th, then you have to continue counting.
Okay, we're having a slight difficulty hearing you at the moment. Your audio is chipping out slightly. Okay, let's try that again.
Better? Is this any better?
Much better.
Oh,
thank you.
Okay. All right. From the nomination to the date of election, you must have 7 clear days. so that nomination occurs on the 9th, then you would have election. So from the writs being issued to an election day, the minimum time period would be 17 days. All right. Now, the next important thing in an election, and probably the most important thing, would be the voters list. And as we know, that everybody who is qualified to vote has the right to register up the date when the writs are issued. And that is important. I want you to remember that. You can register up to the day when the writs are issued. Now, an important document in this process is the register of voters. And the register of voters has to be published by the 31st of January every year. And that is according to Section 46 of the National Assembly Elections Act. And what that would entail is all the persons who would have been registered to vote from, in this case, from January 2019, and then all of the monthly revised list for 2019. Those names will appear on the register of voters that must be issued and would have been issued on January 31st. Another important list is the monthly list. And the monthly list is usually what has to be published by the 15th of the following month for the month that it represents. So a monthly list for January has to come by the 15th of February. And that would have everyone transferred to that constituency from another constituency because of a change in address. It will also include everyone who changes their address within the constituency. So for example, if someone moves from Fig Tree to live in Crab Hill or to live in Mount Idle, their names will appear on the monthly list if they transfer their name from one polling station to the next. It will also have everybody who turns 18 and is qualified to vote who goes to register, and persons who are qualified otherwise. For example, a Commonwealth national living here, they might be 25 years old, but they can't register until they would have been continuously resident in St. Kitts and Nevis for 12 months. And so after that, they can go to register and they appear on the monthly list. Now, in relations to the monthly list, there is a period where persons can object to somebody appearing on that monthly list. And that period is usually 10 days after the list is published. And then one of the most important lists would be the revised monthly list. And that revised monthly list would come after the objection hearings for a particular month would have been held. And it has to, so the revised monthly list for January, for example, must be published. Sections 46 and 48 would be what make up the election register, the election voters register. So that, for example, if the election is announced on the 1st of June and writs are issued, then persons who appeared on the master list in January, as well as everyone who would have been placed on the revised monthly register. And so you have to count that it takes almost 3 months for a revised monthly register to come out, so that the revised monthly register that would come out at the end of May, for example, would be for March. And so if an election were to be called and writs issued on the 1st of June, people who were registered up to March and appearing on the list in May are the ones who would be able to vote. I'm hopeful that that brief information would be able to trigger some conversation, and I'll be happy to answer any questions in relations to that information and any other part of the National Assembly Elections Act.
All right, thank you so much, Krios. Because we had a little bit of interruption, I want you to tell persons what if what when the writs are issued, at what times should polling stations currently be opened?
Polling stations, the National Assembly Elections Act stipulates when polling stations are open. The writs can say what time they open, but if the writs don't say, then they open. I think it's from 7 to 6 or 6 to 7.
As it is in the Regulations Act.
To wear your mask in the line and all of that, but it would be necessary for you to remove that mask so that you can be identified. Remember that when you go into the polling station, you have to show that you are registered to vote and that you are a particular person whose name is on that register. And so you can't do that. The people in there wouldn't be able to identify you if you're wearing your mask. And of course, the polling station most likely would be a public place, right? But I mean, we might be far away from election. We might be
May be very similar to that hospitalized scenario as it is as we know it now.
well, you know, someone who is hospitalized probably can leave the hospital without any serious repercussions, as opposed to someone who is in quarantine. I think if you're in quarantine, you're obligated to stay there. I don't know the exact specifics. Someone I spoke to told me they would have had to sign a document agreeing to certain things in relation to being quarantined. Uh, so those matters would have to be considered. I'm not sure that they are exactly the same, but my thinking is that someone who is quarantined still has the right to vote, and that is a very important right. We always hear about persons being encouraged to exercise their franchise because it was a hard fought right that we now are able to exercise.
All right, thank you. I'm just wondering if any of the panelists have any input as it relates to quarantine and hospitalization on election day.
Jesse?
When you know, I was
Jesse?
actually thinking.
Jesse?
Okay, so we have Gath and Gian weighing in and Azad.
Azad?
Okay, so we're gonna go with Gian. Hold on. let's go with Gian.
No, I was just saying, remember Azad gave his presentation talking about the reasons why we have to do the things that we're doing. We all know why we're under these regulations with COVID-19. So the persons who are in quarantine, this might raise questions of health. I mean, if they have to be away from us under certain under no regular circumstances, is it safe for us to make a recommendation for them to be able, or should it be that they go to the polls at a certain time when the rest of the public is not there? I don't know, but that's something worth considering. But just to say, in terms of regulations, we have the National Assembly Act, and that is very, very, very precise about what can happen on election day. But I think personally that we're going to have to create some specific regulations relating to elections 2020 that speak to the circumstances that we're in now, because there are so many there are things that we didn't even think about, like pencils, the pencils that we vote with. Are we going to be using the same pencil? Or do you have to walk with your own pencil? Does somebody have to check your pencil if we're allowed to walk with pencils? So I think we really need to map out the election day, particularly, and see all of the different contact points where we will have to make specific provision for dealing with this pandemic.
Thank you so much, Diane. You forgot that we may have to also sanitize those pencils. And as as I had wanted to make an input, I just wanted to hear what is your opinion on the COVID, the voting of quarantine hospitalized persons as it relates to the SOE and election day.
Okay. Thank you, Desi. My opinion is that we were talking about hospitalized persons in quarantine. I think it's very important that we understand the nature in which we are dealing with individuals. We're dealing with a pandemic. We're dealing with a very highly infectious pandemic. A hospitalized person, they may be hospitalized for various reasons. Whatever they are hospitalized for might not be something that is highly contagious. So removing them from the where they are hospitalized to bring them to a location like a polling station might not be disastrous on the nation, so to speak, because it's not something that's highly contagious. I think our situation when it comes to COVID-19 is a completely different situation. It is a pandemic of serious magnitude and effect, and I think we need to be aware and cautious of the fact that it is a very highly contagious virus, and I think that in guiding our thinking, we ought to understand that it's not like any other virus that we face with, and it has brought the world to its knees, so to speak. And so I understand Creole's when you talk about the right to vote, but it must be somewhat balanced with the right to public safety and public health. So anything that is done in that regard must be done very carefully to balance both. And of course, if we look at situations, the court has often guided itself when it comes to matters of national security, when it comes to matters of public safety, to err on the side of public safety.
Thank you so much, Azad. So I know Gath would really like, and you wanted to make an input as well.
Yeah, I just wanted to chime in a bit. As Azad said, and Jill, there has to be carefully crafted regulations to deal specifically with the election. In terms of the National Assembly legislation, it allows the right to specify time. So, for example, I really can't see the polls opening before 6 a.m. because all of the returning officers and all of the electoral supervisors have to get ready and have everything in place for persons to go to the polls. But certainly there should be nothing wrong with the polls, for example, opening at 6 and closing at 10 p.m. And potentially what you could do is you can say, listen, anyone that is not in quarantine, we're going to have physical distancing mechanisms at the polls. You had to wait in a long line anyway. The line must be longer, not in terms of number of people, but in terms of the physical distance of the line. And we are going to therefore close polls to non-quarantine people at 8 p.m. as opposed to 6 p.m., for example, so that there's a little extra time to facilitate that and all of the different actual physical sanitization tasks that have to take place within the polling areas. And then you could say, we will, the government arrange for all quarantined persons to between 8 and 10. This is a process, a thought process that I hope is being done by the powers that be at the moment, because it is pretty clear that the distancing requirements that we have now under the state of emergency will continue to at least August 11th when we have to have the election, or August 10th. So I think it has to be very carefully crafted. I mean, for example, there can be plexiglass that protects the officers when you enter. I'm not so sure how you'll be able to do the finger ink, but there has to be, maybe they'll have personalized finger inks for each person that are disposable. You can, I mean, if the government has to spend a little extra money to get 40,000 pencils, I think that extra money of our money is worth it to keep people safe and sanitized. Or what you can do is you can have a certain amount of pencils that can last for an hour, and then you take advice from the CMO how to cleanse a particular group of pencils that were used for the previous hour so they can be used the hour after that. There are lots of mechanisms that can be put in place to ensure that people are kept safe. But from the time we open our border, are going to be much more at risk than potentially we are now, with only one known case and no new cases for the last almost 3 weeks. But this election is going to take place in a time where I suspect that a lot of the places where people come home to vote from, New York, Miami, England, are going to have second waves. And those persons who choose to come home, taking the risk that they won't be able to get back. I'm not sure how many people will take that risk, but those who do take that risk, certainly when they land here, are going to be for at least 14 days and probably maybe even 21. And once they come, they have the right to vote on the voters list. But there is a middle ground in making provisions for them to vote from everyone else. For example, the essential workers, I think, last time voted on the Saturday before Krios. The persons that had to work on polling day.
That amendment was repealed, so that's not possible anymore.
Okay, so that was a specific amendment that was needed. I think one other thing we must point out is that the Constitution makes provisions for the Governor General to call back the National Assembly to sit if there need to be any amendments to the legislation to facilitate elections during a time like this. So it's not as if all is not lost in terms of amendments. That is possible, but it also potentially be done by way of specific regulations that deal with the elections. But we have to be smart about it.
To see?
So,
My disappointment, my only disappointment at this point in time, though, is that it's now 88 days. I mean, people went virtual after we had to get locked down, but I don't think we have to recognize that the election commission has a role to play in all of this, and at least by now and during all of the lockdowns and so on, conversations should have been happening, and information and input should have been solicited from the public, from candidates, from parties, from everyone involved, so that we come up with the best solution to this problem, because it's not going to be easy, and at this stage we are still speculating. The issue is that an election could come in the next 17 days, literally, and we don't know what will happen.
Okay, Gian, go ahead.
That's the point that I was just about to make. But because to me, we know what's happening. It's not like elections is just dropping out of the sky. We know that it's coming. We know that the deadline is coming, and we have to think about these special considerations. This is not a normal election, and so we really need to be bringing the parties together and getting the public's views on how we could solve this. You know, something as simple as what Gat mentioned with the ink. I found it so interesting that in the Assembly, the Elections Act, it is an offense to even refuse to have your finger dipped in the ink, and it tells you specifically you have to immerse your finger into the ink. So something as simple as that, we can't really be immersing finger in all of us finger in ink. You dipping your finger, come out with corona kind of vibes. I don't think that's a safe a safe solution for us at all. So this is why I'm saying that we really have to sit down and be practical and sort out the logistics, because we know this thing is coming. Unfortunately, only one person knows when the elections is, at least, or the prime minister has the power to say when it is. So he knows when it is. He probably has his idea and whatnot. But the point is that we don't know, and people should feel comfortable knowing that when they go to exercise their right to vote, that they will be safe to do so in the context of this era that we're living in. So we really need to bring parties together, get the public's views, think about all the instances that now have to change because we're in this era. So we already hear talk about the age, talk about having to identify yourself, even having to hand your ID to the presiding officer. How are the scrutineers who are in the poll? You know, they usually have to sit next to each other and make sure that each other is doing the work, but they now have to be 6 feet apart. So are they comfortable doing that? So practically, we have to really sit down and say, okay, we used to do this, but because of Corona, we can't do this no more for this time. So we need to set very, very specific regulations for 2020 elections, in my opinion.
So on that note, there was a question that specifically asked about these regulations, and you guys made some really good points about possibly getting new pencils, the understanding that we have to extend the lines, understanding that we may have to reconsider dipping in ink situation. But there was actually a comment that intrigues me a bit, and I would ask this question, seeing that the person mentioned the issue of electronic voting. Is there, and maybe Chris may be able to answer this question since he made the presentation on elections, is there a regulation, or has it been legislated in the way in which we should? So we do everything a bit manually. We do everything with pencils. We know across the world, in more ICT capable countries, they're using electronic voting. What are the possibilities of St. Kitts and Nevis perhaps going that route, so that we could be able to maybe take better precautions as it relates to managing the effects of COVID-19?
Well, uh, and this came up last night, and I'm happy to repeat that the National Assembly Elections Act only provides you one way to cast your ballot. You have to be registered to vote. You have to show up at the polling station, stand in the line, be called in, have the checks. You must have an ID, either your national ID or some other government issued ID. But my reading of the legislation is that you must have identification, and so that you are able to be handed that pencil and be able to vote. Just a little bit more on the, you know, that they had elections in South Korea. On that experience, in my reading, one of the things that they did was, once you entered the polling station, your hands had to be sanitized, you were checked with a thermometer gun. If your temperature was at a certain level, you would then have to go to a zone that is specially created for you to vote. That can happen in our context without any change in the legislation. But any consideration about mail-in votes, electronic votes, as for now, that is a no. Especially for electronic voting, I think that will never happen in our election. There isn't enough time, even if you legislate for it.
Because even though, as Chris said, even though you might legislate, you must understand that steps will have to be put in place, and persons being able persons being able to deal with the technology is not a, that means going through and teaching persons what to do, educating the public, which might at this point in time might not give us enough time.
Yes, and additionally, I mentioned the international travel, the ban on international travel. That is a very important aspect of this discussion as well, because I know persons get bogged down about thinking about overseas voters who ordinarily reside overseas. But what about those persons who went on vacation just before the election, had all intentions to come back, and if elections were called then had intentions to come back into the country? Can we say that we did not have enough time, perhaps, to have considered mail-in votes? Because this thing, we went into lockdown on March 28th, I think, or thereabout. That has been a month and probably a lot of discussions taking place then. I think it would have been something extraordinary in our beloved land of St. Christopher and Nevis if both Labour candidates and Unity candidates could have come to the country and said, after a month of deliberations, this is how we think that we want elections to look for this 2020 election. That would
But
have been
Chris,
something extraordinary.
I think we're forgetting the situation we were in just a month ago. Just I mean, right now we are basically in the clear, so to speak. But a month ago, when we had confirmed 2 cases of the coronavirus, persons being infected, I think that the major focus then was the fact that the state needs to protect its citizens. So I think it's good to say in hindsight maybe that is what should have been considered, but at the point in time, I think major considerations were being made to ensuring that the spread of this infectious disease was not widespread, and to ensure that it was contained as much as possible.
Um,
I don't know what happens
But,
behind the
that,
scene, Azad. I don't know what happens
yeah,
behind the scene,
um,
but
but
if it,
aren't we capable of focusing on more than one thing at a time? That's why we have officials. So
And
even though
commissioner.
maybe you may have the ministers really focused as they should on what's happening and making sure regulations are being formed and enforced, we have an electoral office. We have a supervisor of elections who could have been given a mandate to be working on this all along. So even though some of us and most of us would have been focused on um, COVID-19 and all of the strategies and protocols, the rest of the country still had to operate and try to find ways to operate. People have been asked to work from home. It's what has had to happen as a result. So those of us who have responsibilities under the law in terms of making sure that our regulations are in place and things are in place for elections, they had that job a month ago. So they could have been given a mandate to at least start the process. Maybe not complete it, because you need, of course, the attention of the Attorney General and the Prime Minister, who were very busy and occupied with the strategies for COVID. But the fact of the matter is, there's a whole electoral office. What were they doing? Why couldn't they be thinking about this, starting consultations even virtually? I really
I mean,
don't accept that, Azad, that, we a month ago we were all focused on COVID. Yes, we were all focused and rightfully so on COVID, but the fact is that we know that this election is coming and we know the importance of it. The same way the hospital still had to operate for the people who weren't COVID patients. The same way police still had to think about people who aren't wearing masks. We still had to operate, even though COVID took a prominent place in our focus.
Thank you so much, Gian. I think Garth wanted to make an input on the same topic.
Yeah. I just wanted to say that when the pandemic and the lockdowns began, one of my first thoughts, because I had a lot of time to think, being home, was that it would be so mature for the government to simply say, listen, we don't know how long we're going to be in this. However, there's no possible way that the election can go past, at that time, August 11th. So let's set the furthest date out for the election. Let us let the electoral technocrats figure out how we're going to accomplish voting during an election in this situation, because we all, within a couple of weeks of the lockdown, what the situation was, because we saw what in countries that were more advanced than us in the lockdown situation, and the fact that there was a way under the Constitution that the election could go past August 11th. I'm actually, frankly, very tired of the macho man stupidity that comes with this. I am holding the data actions in my back pocket that we've seen throughout the Caribbean throughout time. I'm fed up of it. It's very immature, in my opinion. This whole idea that, oh, I have the constitutional right, I'm the big bad prime minister, and I could then set the election when I want it to be. I mean, think about the people for once. Think about the people. Think about how good it would have been for the people to have some certainty and say, listen, we're going through a serious issue we never see. However, there's nothing in our constitution that allows us to push back the election. Let's set it for August 10th, August 9th, whenever. And then I promise you that we are going to have people working day and night to figure a plan, right, that is best for all of our people, right? That was my view early on. So I don't know why we're getting to this point where dissolution, you don't know when it's happening. Election, you don't know when it's happening. That's why I really hope to see a female prime minister in my lifetime, because we'll get away from all this macho, I don't want to use any bad words, but I'm tired of it. I'm fed up of it. Look how good it would have been. You know, you would have had a couple months to educate people about what the election would look like. Even now, there's no possible way I can see it being reasonable to have an election in 6 weeks, because you have to have at least a month to educate people and make people feel comfortable that the system that's going to be in place during this time is a system that will make you come out and go to vote, and you're not putting yourself at risk. So you need to have a educational program. Why not just put the election to the outer boundary of when it should be and educate the people? But it's all about political maneuvering, and that's all that matters to the political parties. And I'm saying that particularly for Creos and Azar to hear, because they have the ear of the decision makers. We are tired of this. We're tired of all this political maneuvering. You know, let's just set a date, let people decide, and we go from there. You campaign virtually, right? The opposition says what the government hasn't done. The government says what they have done and why you should vote for them. And let's end this maneuvering and all of these machinations that go on with the macho man holding the O, and I know when I can call election, and dissolving parliament, and they're trying to pass boundaries. I'm fed up of it personally. And that is why I personally don't have any side, because as far as I'm concerned, I'm not supporting any party that focuses on machinations and political maneuvering more than the people. And we shouldn't be having this debate. We should have a clear picture as to how our election should look, because our election is imminent. The only that could change our election date is if we had a hurricane and wiped out the place a couple of days before election, or Antigua decided they were going to start shooting bombs at us. So why not do the mature thing? I just really don't understand.
Gas.
But I mean,
All
that's
right.
a fact.
All right, so thank you, Garth, for that passionate input. So we have some persons weighing in on some of the comments that were made. So, for instance, persons are saying, someone mentioned that in the recent by-election in Nevis, they expressed their concern of using the ink, and the supervising officer would have indicated that there's nothing that would happen to them. But I have someone here who is actually recommending that they consider spraying the finger with something similar to the ink. Perhaps that's something that we could take into consideration. We know that we're not totally locked down from going back and making a resolution that would be able to make some temporary adjustments, perhaps, with the situation that we're currently facing. We also have individuals saying that along the lines of what Garth spoke about, having action dates said already are set. Somebody's saying that they should really have dates fixed because it's really fair for everyone. And you have Miss Duncan weighing in when we spoke about the issue of overseas voters or persons who probably are citizens working overseas, perhaps in embassies and so forth. We could actually have different embassies across the world representing St. Kitts and Nevis allow persons to vote. Is that something that's an interesting input? Send a copy of their IDs, check and say who they want to vote for. Isn't these reasons why we have that support in territories that we support overseas? So I don't know if that's an issue, but that's a recommendation from online.
Desi, one
Well,
of the things,
you know, it's
sorry, Chris, but one of the things I was even thinking, even with the ink, I like that about spraying it, but it could be even something as simple as getting one of those droppers, like an oil dropper, and they drop the ink on your finger. And well, but then again, it's still the same, might be contaminated ink, so maybe not. But we have to do something. But my point is with these regulations, though, is Azad referenced the Emergency Powers Act earlier. And one of the things that's in the act is that the Governor General has the power to make, and I'm quoting, regulations which are reasonably justifiable for dealing with the situation that exists in the state. So whatever needs to be done that is reasonably justifiable, the Governor General has the right to make those regulations. And it is under that act that our current regulations that say we have to stay home and we have to be in the house by 8 p.m., that act is the source of the power for the regulations that we're currently under. So I believe that specific regulations can be made under the Emergency Powers Act that speak specifically to elections in a way that is reasonably justifiable for dealing with the current situation that's existing in the state, which is a COVID-19 era. The thing about this is I think we have scope to make it whatever we want to be once it is reasonably justifiable. So in terms of extending the times, and I saw some comments last night about increasing the number of polling stations. We can actually do that now under the act. The supervisor of election has the power to say how many polling stations, where need to be the polling station. So there's not a set number of polling stations. So if we even find that in order to help with the social distancing, that we need to make more polling stations, that's a recommendation that has to be considered as well. This is why this conversation needed to happen a long time ago, but it didn't. So the fact of the matter is we can't change the past. We could only move forward, and the conversation needs to start as soon as possible with as many stakeholders as possible.
Yes,
I
I
am
think
I am my curious.
go ahead, Azad.
Yes, based on what Jihanna said, I am minded to agree with her in the sense that the Emergency Powers Act does give the Governor General the authority to do what it takes in order to make sure that we are dealing with the situation at hand, what is reasonably justifiable.
But
Okay,
I don't
Krios?
I think this is as I said, and it's important that it be a matter come out of a matter of consultation because people are going to have varying ideas. I agree that at the end of the day, the final decision would be that of the government. But if we are going to have to get buy-in from the populace at large, then we are going to have to include as many people as possible in the discussions. But time is running out. It's only 88 more days. As a matter of fact, not 88 more days because an election has to be called round about the 15th of of um of not the 15th, maybe a little bit before that. But it has to be called 17 days before the 10th of August.
All right, so we have persons online agreeing with the idea that we need to have these discussions and these discussions so that we could be able to educate the public. In the past, I know some of you have been involved in parties and so forth for a while, actually, specifically Azad and Krios. What really goes into educating the public about how you should vote, because we have to educate persons. You have new voters, and we don't vote every year, so of course we have to go back over the rules about how you use pencil in on the ballot paper, where you go to vote, how do you find out where you go to vote, and that sort of thing. How much goes into educating the public? How much time
Well,
do you think we need?
I don't think I
I
could
think.
remember.
Go ahead, Krios. Krios, hello.
Hello?
The government, either this government or from before, um, on public education vote, I think parties have taken a particular stake in doing that. But that is one-sided. A party is going to tell you how to vote for the hand. They're not really going to tell you anything else more than that.
Or the hat.
But I
Or the
think
hat.
parties tell their voters who they think are their supporters, um, um, that they should have their ID, keep their IDs in a safe place, how they have to make the X. I know that the party that I have some information on would have exercises to educate people or their supporters on how exactly to do that. But I think the ballot paper might only have one name and one side.
Well, as Chris was saying, I think I think a lot of times is the parties that educate the persons who are voting, especially the candidates in each constituency, being able, when they go to meet and greet or whatever, canvassing, educating those persons on what is done on election day. I think it has been taken from a party perspective, more to speak, and I think generally our population does have an understanding. I think young people have an understanding. Perhaps they don't. Those of those of us, well, those young people who have never voted, they don't know how it is inside the polling station, what is done. But I think they have a general understanding that they must make their mark alongside whichever candidate they choose, and the mark must be within the box, and the mark must be clear and distinct. So I think there are certain basic things that persons know about voting. If it could be better, I mean, it can be better. Perhaps a neutral body, maybe like the St. Kitts National Youth Parliament Association, a group of young people that are non-political, a non-political organization like that might be the one of the a good um, organization to spearhead that, educating. I think something like that had been done with Scanepa in the past. I think something like that would have been done in Scanepa in the past. Not too sure, but I think we will have taken on that challenge to educate persons what is expected of them on election day as voters.
I
Yeah,
have.
I still think though the neutral body that Azad was talking about is the electoral office. I still think the electoral office has a responsibility to explain the voting process and what to expect, what to work with, what will be acceptable, what's not acceptable. And we have some really good examples from Dominica as well. For their elections, their electoral office was producing some really good educational material. So it would be useful. I think the electoral office has a responsibility as well to make sure that the public understands, because the parties are not going to go to everybody. As much as they like to think that they touch every soul, they don't capture everybody. So I think they have a responsibility to produce that kind of material, maybe show it in social and traditional media, and it will only help to reinforce whatever the parties themselves do. But if the parties don't, then I still think somebody has to, and that responsibility falls squarely on the electoral office, in my opinion.
Yeah, and I would agree
Desi,
with you. I think the electoral office has a responsibility to educate the voter on what needs to take place on election day. And I think coming up, especially on our current circumstances, our current situation, I think the onus would be greatly placed on the electoral office.
just make up their mind on a couple of days before the election. You want them to feel comfortable to go to the polls, because the hardcore party supporters on whichever side are likely to go to the polls whether they feel safe or not. But the neutral persons that are not very into politics, if they don't feel um, that it's safe from a health perspective to go to the polls, then you're going to lose the votes of those people. Sometimes those are the people that really show the pulse of the country when it comes to an election. So I think that is why it's very important to have an extensive, similar to how you have the New York presentations, and you're hearing from the CMO. You should be hearing from the electoral officials regularly and by different media as to what they're going to do to ensure that you are safe health-wise when you go to the polls. Every person who has the ability to vote will not be scared to exercise their franchise.
All right.
Garth, I
So
agree
we
with
have
you.
persons
I,
asking. Go ahead, Azad.
oh, I was just saying, Garth, I agree with you. And I think when it's time for elections, I would expect the electoral office to educate persons on what the requirements would be on election day.
Azad, the house has been dissolved. It's time for elections. That's the purpose of
Yes, the house was
dissolving the
dissolved
house.
on
It's
Tuesday.
time for elections.
Yeah.
All
Yes,
right.
on
So we have
Tuesday it was
persons
dissolved.
asking, what is what is reasonable justifiable? Who determines that?
The court.
Well, if it
The
comes to the court
well,
would
it's that's a
determine.
simple answer, because the cabinet now, the sorry, go ahead.
Yes, I mean, it gives the governor general the power in his own perspective to determine what is reasonably justifiable. I think if it comes to a matter of the court, though, if it's questioned or challenged, then the court would have to decide whether or not the governor general, acting on the circumstances that surrounded him, acted reasonably.
All right, so we have a question. We have actually two questions to look at. And someone is asking, is there a possibility that we could have votes counted at the polling stations to avoid lengthy waits for results?
I think that is what is happening this time around. I think that the electoral office would have mentioned that, but I think that is what is happening this time around. That the votes will be counted at the spot rather than being transported to a central location like in the past.
All right. So what we didn't speak about the most vulnerable persons, and there's a concern. How do we deal with, and whether it's within COVID-19 or outside of a national security issue, how do we deal with senior citizens, the disabled, pregnant mothers, nursing mothers, and persons with pre-existing conditions as it relates to elections and the voting on election day?
Desi,
Probably the
I think
same way that we have specific lines for those persons. It's totally within the scope of the supervisor of elections to designate special areas at polling stations or special lines at polling stations for those persons. So it's something that if people feel very passionate about, particularly in this COVID-19 era, about not wanting to be standing around for too long, then they may have to really make their voice heard about that. The pre-existing people with pre-existing conditions, I'm not sure if you might be asked to bring a doctor paper to say that you have a pre-existing condition that qualifies you to stand in this specific line. But I think it's within the scope of the supervisor of elections to designate that special conditions be extended to those persons in the instance of to preventing them from standing in long lines.
Yeah, Desi, my
Yes,
view on
sir.
that is that the banks have been making provisions for elderly persons, the most vulnerable, to come into the bank without line up. So it could be the electoral commission could persons over 60. We prefer if you come between 6 and 9, and we will also have a fast track line. The problem that arises is with the pre-existing people, because persons with diabetes and heart problems and so forth who are high risk, they might feel uncomfortable going into the quick line for people to judge them. So it has to be carefully thought out how you're going to accomplish that. But you definitely need to separate the most vulnerable from the quarantines.
All right. So we've gotten through quite a few recommendations as how we could move forward as it relates to elections. We have about 10 more minutes into our conversation. Azad, Krios, do you have anything to add as it relates to the questions asked?
Just a general comment. I think that this election is different from all other elections that we face. I think that we should be mindful of the circumstances that we are currently facing, COVID-19, the pandemic, and we should all try to be understanding given the situation and the current circumstances. We have to be proactive. We have to be, this is a whole different situation, and I think we all, I don't think there's any political party that has experienced in our recent time what we are experiencing now. And of course, it takes a whole different approach this time around than what we are expected, that we have been expected, what we have expected. Sorry, go ahead.
Krios?
I think I think that I agree that this is really unprecedented. And if that is so, then it means that neither the government or anybody on the opposition is, well, we don't have benches anymore because Parliament has been dissolved. But no one did. So what it takes is a combined effort, an opportunity for everybody to have an input. We know who the final decision makers are, that is a given. But we are in an election mode, and there are still outstanding issues about the regulations before gave some privileges to parliamentarians. There are now no parliamentarians as Parliament has been dissolved. So who now are those privileges assigned to? And I am hoping, for fairness sake, that it is not just to ministers of government, but that these times, if our democracy is going to survive this COVID-19 pandemic, because we have to live after this has gone, or we might have to live with it for some time. Fairness and transparency in the process must happen. And I believe that is full time that all candidates, at least one party has declared all of its candidates for the upcoming elections, and they should be given certain rights and privileges, because an election is going to happen and they have to campaign and they have to reach the voter, and they are able to take particular precautions to protect themselves and to protect the citizens of our country. And I don't think that it's the government alone and their individuals might stand for elections are the only one capable of taking such precautions. And so that is going to be an important factor moving into the next regulations that should come.
All right. All right, so we covered quite a lot, and I just wanted to go over some information. We made quite a few suggestions. I see that persons are asking, are the decision makers listening? But I know Garth alluded to earlier that we have two persons, sitting here with us who have the ears of the decision makers, and we're hoping that some of what was discussed would be taken back to the table for consideration. We spoke about being able to come together, the opposition, well, as it stands now, all of the participating parties how come together and talk about how could we move forward with COVID-19 as elections are approaching. We made suggestions as to opening the polling stations from 6 to 10, and then having those quarantined persons coming maybe between 8 and 10 in the
Well, I
evening,
think
looking at
we didn't make a
safety.
decision on quarantine persons coming. I think it was still up for discussion.
Recommendation.
Right.
It just this is
Recommendation.
came
It's a
up.
That
recommendation.
we
Calm
have,
down.
We
So like
we
Azar don't
also
want these
discussed
people to vote.
ah, we also discussed the safety of persons coming in a COVID-19 environment. Are we going to still be dipping in ink? Are we going to spray ink? Are we going to use multiple pencils? What about electronic means and so forth? How are we moving forward as we cast our ballots at the polling station on election day? We mentioned that the Governor General can call back the National Assembly. It was mentioned by Gath that to be able to make new legislations or resolution that can make these adjustments so that we could be able to to guide how the elections would go by. It was also stated by Azad that the state of emergency gives the Governor General the power to make any sort of input to be able to guide the way in which we will go forward with elections. We spoke about how that we should have had the ball rolling a long time ago, because to be honest, before March 28th, when we did lockdown, the issue of the pandemic was looming in the world. So we had other countries being hugely affected. We had our borders open, the US had their borders open, and so it was somewhat inevitable that we would experience this pandemic and the effects of it. So we also challenge the responsibility of the electoral office and how they should be having a wide sweeping educational campaign to be able to teach persons of on how to vote, what it is like going into elections. So as we wrap up now, I don't know if any of you have one single, it's short, very short. You have about 30 seconds to make a contribution on the topics that were discussed before we wrap up.
Well, Gav, go ahead. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to mention two things in the wrap up. I know there was a question posed yesterday about whether because there was there was a requirement to have the by-election for constituency number 6 within 90 days. That is null and void now, because once Parliament is dissolved, that time frame moves into the general election time frame. So there will be no by-election for number 6. Krios predicts that there will be no election for number 6, but we'll see what happens. And in relation to the public information campaign about voting, I saw a video. I think it was either somewhere in the Middle East, either Qatar or UAE, with what their airports are doing to adjust to the new normal. I think it's fair. Videos, as I say, a picture is worth a word, so a video is probably worth a million. I think it would be important if the electoral office were to produce a video showing voters what the new normal voting process would look like.
All right, thank you so much. Any other input?
I guess just in closing, I think the only thing I would really add is, yeah, we really need to stop saying election is coming. It's here. The process has started. When the house is dissolved, the house gets dissolved for the purpose of election. So the process has started. So we are way behind the ball, and we just need to get up to it. And I'm hoping that the public will use the kind of information that we've tried to give on this show, and their own practical common sense about what the day should look like. Should we have an election on a day where everything is closed? So the only reason you could possibly have to leave your house is to go vote and go home, to make sure there's not too much assembling and activity of the sort. So we have to think about our safety. This is a time that's unprecedented, and it's going to require us to really put our heads together. And I am adamant about this putting our heads together. It should not just be government alone. It has to involve the other parties, the interested persons as well. It must be public consultation. Zoom could hold a lot of people. And that's all I would say about that.
I would leave my learned senior Garth to wrap up. So I'll go now and say that, I think that we've had a good conversation. I'm grateful for the opportunity to have participated. I think that young people should take part in political conversations. It's just how it's been done, in a respectful manner, one that is fact-based, one that is evidence-based. And with that said, I accept your invitation, Desi, to come back whenever we begin to assess the records of both sides that would be going up for these elections.
Azad, you on board?
Yes, I'm here.
Unity versus labor. Which one is better? Administration? Is that a show? Should we make that a show?
That sounds like
we can
make
that a
like
show.
an invitation for the.
Of course, we can make that a show, because then it would be a whole different ball game than what we had here. But
Okay, that sounds like a threat, Chris. That sounds like a threat.
I wish to thank Desi and Jihan for extending the invitation to me. It has been a very delightful discussion, and I wish to thank those persons who tuned in and listened. I mean, there could have been otherwise listening to other people or doing something else, but they chose to listen to us, and I wish to thank them for adding to this discussion.
All right. Gap?
Yeah, thank you for inviting me. I don't know if my tirade today, I don't have a chance of being invited again, but I hope I will. I definitely won't be there when the party is trying to convince people to vote for them, but I'll be listening. And I really thank Gian and Desi for thinking this up and make reality. I think it's very good. I mean, I've gotten some good feedback. You know, people want an avenue to have frank discussion about the attacking, and I think we have shown that even though Krios and Azad are on total opposite sides in a very intense time, election time, they were very respectful of each other. They were giving each other an opportunity to speak. They were letting the other person go in front of them. Politics doesn't have to be divisive. If you have your belief, you stick to your belief and you stick to the persons who you believe in, but you be respectful and you have honest and frank debate. And I think this is a perfect avenue for that. And there are lots of people who appreciate Desi and Gian have thought of. And to all the persons for making it happen, I'm thankful.
All right. So, as we end out this evening, I would like to remind everyone that our floor is open for you to make as many suggestions as you would like for who do you think the next panelist should be. We should be talking about why you should be voting in the next general elections, as we especially speak to young people and how they can be affected in 5 to 10 years of their life when they get children and own land and so forth. So we are looking forward to having that discussion and bringing in maybe a new panel. So if you do have any suggestions or you yourself feel like you can make a valuable contribution to the conversation, we welcome you with open arms. So that ends this edition of Alarm Clock. We spoke about the dissolution of Parliament as well as elections in COVID-19. We looked at the boundary situation and the decisions that were made in the 2015 case by the Privy Council. And everything will be saved to our YouTube and Facebook pages. And we're expecting you guys to go back, draw reference on the content, and definitely use the facts that you received to engage in only fair and non-tribal discussions. Please be respectful of each other's views. Whoever supports whatever political party, if you don't support any political party, just be reasonable with the way in which you present your facts and make your arguments. Thank you so much for logging in, and we're out.
Goodbye.
Good night.